In the 1950s, a report appeared of a man who cured his own terminal cancer through the power of belief. Every time I ran into this story, it was a little bit different. It's been repeated so many times that the details are covered in a few layers of myth. But in general, the story goes like this. Sometime in the mid-1950s, there was a man named Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright was in the hospital. He had an advanced case of lymphosarcoma. He was bedridden, covered in orange-sized tumors, anemic. Every other day they were draining off 2 liters of milky fluid from his lungs just so he could breathe. His physician, Dr. Philip M. West, gave Wright weeks to live at best. But Mr. Wright held on to hope because he had read a newspaper report about a miracle cancer treatment called Krebiozen, and he was sure that this would be his salvation. Mr. Wright lived up to his name. His very hospital was to be one of 100 different test sites for the miracle cure. There was just one problem. The protocols for this trial required that someone both be beyond the point where standard therapies would benefit them and have a minimum life expectancy of between 3 to 6 months. Mr. Wright didn't qualify for the trial. The hospital was only sent enough Krebiozen to treat 12 selected cases, and Mr. Wright was determined to be one of those 12 people. He begged, pestered, and pleaded so much that Dr. West decided to include him anyway. West gave Mr. Wright an injection of Krebiozen on a Friday before leaving for the weekend. When he came back on Monday, he expected Mr. Wright to be dead, but instead he found him strolling around the ward, happily talking to nurses and patients and anyone else who would listen. To the amazement of Dr. West, Wright's tumors had, quote, melted away like snowballs on a hot stove. They were half the size that they'd been only days before, all from one injection of Krebiozen in what was supposed to be a weeks-long trial with multiple injections per week. And the good news kept coming. They continued with the planned course of injections, and within 10 days, all signs of Mr. Wright's lymphosarcoma had practically vanished. He was discharged from the hospital and even went flying without any breathing problems at all. It was a miracle, but it turned out to be a temporary one. Mr. Wright started to hear news reports that Krebiozen wasn't what it claimed to be, that it didn't work. The makers of the drug insisted that it was effective and they dismissed these reports as rumors, but doubts crept in. After 2 months of nearly perfect health, Mr. Wright was back in the hospital, relapsed to his original state. And that's when Wright's doctor came up with a plan. Dr. West saw an opportunity to test the effectiveness of Krebiozen, to test the power of the placebo effect, and to maybe save his patient's life. He told Mr. Wright that Krebiozen lost potency quickly after it was manufactured, something they didn't initially know because it was a brand new drug. This was the cause of the bad reports that Wright had heard and the cause of his relapse as the dose wore off. West went on to say that he had requested a double-strength, super potent shipment of Krebiozen, and it was already on the way. Mr. Wright was ecstatic. What he didn't know was that this extra-strength Krebiozen was, in fact, just purified water, injected with fanfare and theatrics. According to the literature, it worked like a charm, even better than it had the first time. Wright's tumors disappeared, his lungs cleared, he went back to flying, presumably with his brother Orville. He was, quote, the picture of health for another 2 months. And that's when the American Medical Association released their final report that declared Krebiozen was worthless in the treatment of cancer. Within a few days, Mr. Wright was back in the hospital. He died 2 days later. This whole story sits at that sweet spot between scientific legitimacy and friggin' magic, which is why it pops up all over the place. It's been cited by more than 50 academic papers since it was first published. It's the go-to intro story for any popular science article about the mysterious power of the placebo effect. And some sloppy variation of it is at the start of almost every pitch about how you too can harness the healing power of your mind for only 4 easy payments of $99.99. Whatever it's used for, the Wright case is fascinating because it's either a documented miracle, a huge f*** up, or a scam. And to figure out which one, I had to answer the following questions. Did these people exist? Was there a Dr. West? And was Mr. Wright his patient? Where did this story start? And what the is Krebiozen? On March 27, 1951, Dr. Andrew Ivy held a press conference to announce a powerful new cancer treatment called Krebiozen. He made his announcement at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. He invited the mayor, a few senators, major newspapers, and a few potential financial backers. Typically, a discovery like this would be discussed with other academics, vetted, and then submitted to an academic journal for review, not just announced at a press conference. Notably absent from this shindig were many other scientists, including the head tumor surgeon, the dean of the College of Medicine, and the university president from Ivy's own university. Time magazine had called Andrew Ivy the conscience of American science. In 1946, he was the AMA's representative to the Nuremberg trials for Nazi war criminals. He was the head of the American Cancer Association, and by the time of this press conference, possibly the most well-known and well-respected physiologist in the United States. Ivy told the story of Stefan Durovich, who'd been doing medical research in Argentina since fleeing Europe during World War II. Durovich claimed to have a secret formula that eliminated cancer in his research. Ivy backed up this claim, stating that he had done his own trial with 22 late-stage cancer patients. 14 of them had marked improvement, 2 of them were cured, and the press went crazy. You have to remember that in 1951, a cancer diagnosis was almost always a death sentence. We had like one chemotherapy drug, and it was derived from mustard gas. Understandably, cancer patients nationwide were thrilled to hear about their impending salvation. American doctors were more cautious, especially those who specialized in treating cancer. Cancer was the #1 moneymaker for quacks and cons. Krebiozen wasn't the first time that these doctors had heard of some mysterious yet powerful, non-toxic, non-invasive, inexpensive yet universally applicable treatment for every kind of cancer. Even back in 1951, the AMA had ethics rules against trying unknown or secret remedies on patients. This stopped most researchers from even using it. But Ivy's name carried a lot of weight. Without his reputation behind it, Krebiozen would probably have been ignored. But again, because of Ivy's reputation and the intense national coverage, ampules of Krebiozen were sent out to 6 test sites around the United States. By midsummer, some of the nation's leading cancer specialists had had a chance to compare notes, and the data wasn't encouraging. In a letter sent August 1st, one of Ivy's friends warned him that the AMA was putting a report together, and he urged Ivy to distance himself from Krebiozen, begged with him to take an objective look at the data, and he warned Ivy what would happen if he attached himself firmly to a substance that was starting to look a lot like a scam. Ivy received a few letters like this, and ignored them all. But all of this happened privately within the scientific community. There was nothing about Krebiozen's effectiveness, or lack thereof, in the national press. After that initial announcement, news coverage on Krebiozen was pretty sparse, which makes it extremely unlikely that somebody in a hospital bed in California would hear about any of this. On October 27th, the AMA finally weighed in. Their research committee released a report on its review of 100 test cases, pulled from the 6 research sites and Dr. Ivy's original trial. The report stated, Krebiozen shows no benefit in the treatment of cancer, all of which made for bitter headlines nationwide. And that might have been the end of it. Krebiozen would have joined the list of other sham cancer treatments that were exposed during the 1950s. Instead, Dr. Ivy and the Durovich brothers howled conspiracy. They said it was all an attempt to cut them out of the huge profits to come, or to just make an example out of them for refusing to know their place. And this started a decades-long battle between Ivy with his Krebiozen allies and pretty much everyone else in the medical establishment. Ivy refused to take back his claims about Krebiozen, and he continued to distribute the drug to anyone who requested it for further research and trial purposes. To test how selective the foundation was about sending out its product, one doctor requested Krebiozen for a patient with, quote, a complete double pneumonectomy, doctor speak for the removal of both lungs. Like would kill you. But wouldn't you know it, his Krebiozen arrived with a request for a donation of at least $9.50. There were no standard protocols for these individual experiments, and some of the patients didn't even know what they'd been injected with. There was never a scientifically rigorous, organized trial of Krebiozen, because the Duroviches refused to comply with experimental guidelines, all while accusing the AMA, the NCS, and the FDA of a vast conspiracy. But the Krebiozen Research Foundation kept their own case files detailing the amazing success of Krebiozen, mostly in the form of questionnaires and anecdotes sent in from doctors all over the country. So, for more than a decade, doctors who didn't know what Krebiozen was were injecting it into people without telling them. Desperate people always make a seller's market. You can make a fortune with just a little creativity and a willingness to hurt other people for money. The whole Krebiozen story becomes like a buffet for terrible people. And eager to take his place in the scumbag Hall of Fame, a Chicago news reporter named Herbert Bailey released 2 best-selling books fanning the flames of the Krebiozen conspiracy theory. If you preferred fame over fortune, the controversy generated hearings, legislation, press releases, town hall meetings. Ivy made for a powerful political ally, and plenty of politicians got involved as well. So involved that the debate made it all the way to the halls of the US Congress. Finally, in 1963, the newly empowered FDA conducted a complete investigation of the KRF case files. They found that after 1960, Krebiozen contained creatine, dissolved in mineral oil. But for any sample sent out before 1960, it was just mineral oil alone. In 1966, Dr. Ivy and the Dervish brothers were arrested for fraud. During a marathon 10-month trial, the prosecution provided tons of evidence detailing this years-long nationwide scam. The defense had a different strategy. They put dozens of people on the stand who claimed that they'd been cured of cancer, or who begged the jury not to take away their Krebiozen because they, quote, needed it to live. In the end, Ivy and the Dervish brothers were acquitted of all charges, because the jury didn't want to take away people's hope. After the trial, the Dervish brothers fled the country to escape tax evasion charges, and Krebiozen limped along until Ivy's death in 1978. The 12,000 pages of testimony, half a dozen books, and hundreds of reports on Krebiozen don't add up to a cure for cancer, but they do give us a concrete timeline for the story of Mr. Wright. If the FDA can use shiny new technology to show that Krebiozen was just a fancy word for mineral oil, maybe we can use new technology to figure out if the curious case of Mr. Wright is just a fancy name for something else. About a third of the time that someone tells the story of Mr. Wright, they screw up the name of the doctor. Instead of Dr. West, they mention a psychologist named Bruno Klopfer. Weirdly, to these people's credit, they actually connected the story to its rightful owner. On the other hand, these same people didn't stop to wonder why a psychologist was handing out experimental chemotherapy drugs, but what are you gonna do? The story of Mr. Wright's story begins in a speech delivered by Bruno Klopfer, the new president of the Society for Projective Techniques. Klopfer was an advocate of something called projective psychology, a kind of psychological personality testing in which the unconscious mind betrays truths that the subject might be trying to hide. The society Klopfer was addressing grew out of workshops he taught on how to use the Rorschach inkblot test. The Rorschach test is an interview given using hand-drawn ink blots made by Hermann Rorschach. Originally, Rorschach had 15 of these drawings, called cards. He was working on a whole system for use with patients who had schizophrenia. He published a book about it in 1921, and then he promptly died the next year. Rorschach never intended his system to be used as a general personality test. He was just at the beginning of developing it when he died. Worse still, the printer would only take 10 of his 15 drawings. And his drawings were all supposed to be solid shapes. The shading and variation in them was a printing error. Which all makes this system basically the psychological equivalent of tarot cards, without the extra 2 centuries of development. Yet, these little inkblot pictures have been used in everything from job interviews to child custody cases. And Bruno Klopfer is absolutely the person most responsible for the popularity of the Rorschach in the US from the 1940s through the 1970s. Eventually, Klopfer took a position as an assistant clinical professor at UCLA. He threw himself and the Rorschach at everything he could, including the local VA hospital. Klopfer mentions this hospital in the same speech where he introduces Mr. Wright. The Wright story is only a small part of this whole speech. The rest of it recalls some research done at this hospital by 2 doctors, Frank Ellis and Philip West. Klopfer says this research was an attempt to connect the personality traits of individual cancer patients to how quickly their disease progressed toward lethality. Klopfer tells us about his involvement with this study, and he mentions that using the Rorschach test, he was able to detect whether someone's cancer would progress quickly or slowly more than 70% of the time. To demonstrate the power of this connection between personality and the body, Klopfer shares a story given to him in a personal communication by Dr. West. It's the story of Mr. Wright. Klopfer's whole speech was later published verbatim in the Journal of Projective Techniques, a journal founded by Bruno Klopfer in 1936. The paper has no references and cites no sources, but it's been cited as a source more than 50 times. So this story shows up for the first time nearly 6 years after the AMA's report on Krebiozen. It's told by psychologist Bruno Klopfer, quoting Philip West. But it does reference a study done at the VA hospital in Long Beach, California, in the early 50s, which is the same time period as Krebiozen's initial release, and the very first results published by the AMA. At least big picture, everything lines up. Whether this is true or not depends on the two other key players in this story, Dr. Philip West, and of course, Mr. Wright. Philip Manthorne West was a real person. He was born in Canada in 1915. He went on to get his MD from Columbia, which is where he began to publish work on cancer. West also took a position at UCLA as an assistant professor of biophysics. In 1949, West and his lab partner made a breakthrough. They created a simple tool that, for the first time ever, allowed a doctor to check for a cancer's presence and progress without cutting someone open. Usually, the most effective thing you could do for someone with a new cancer diagnosis was to send them a heartfelt card wishing them the best of luck. The very first chemotherapy drugs were invented in the late 1940s, and having a blood test that would tell you if a medicine was working or not was a huge development, and it made national news. West was actually named Californian of the Year in 1950. West was only 35 and he already had a brilliant career, with decades still to come. West spent some of his time as an attending physician in the cancer ward of the Long Beach VA hospital. When a PhD candidate named Eugene Blumberg asked if there was any way he could help on the cancer ward, West and Ellis put him to work to test the connection between cancer growth and personality. This is the same study referenced in Bruno Klopfer's 1957 speech. And it was still active directly following the debut of Krebiozen. There really was a Dr. Philip West. In many ways, he was a cancer specialist, and he was working with patients in 1951. All the big pieces corroborate the story of Mr. Wright's miracle. We don't have a hard date for the start of the story, but we do have one for the end. According to Bruno's version of West, Mr. Wright died within a week of hearing the final AMA verdict. The AMA announced their findings on October 27th, putting Mr. Wright's death right around November 1st. The story gives us a rough idea of how much time elapsed from Mr. Wright's initial injection until his death. At its shortest possible duration, Wright's story takes just under 5 months. And if you round up for every instance of time provided by Klopfer, and add a week-ish for West to hatch his devious plan, it takes maybe 5.5 months at its longest. This puts Mr. Wright's first injection around the second week of May to the first week of June. If he got his first injection on a Friday, May 25th it is. Which means a Krebiozen trial must have started at the VA hospital in Long Beach, California, sometime between May 18th and June 1st. It's the last piece we need, but without it, none of this can possibly be true. So did it? Was there? No. There were not 100 test sites selected by the Medical Association, as the story claims. There were 0 test sites selected by the AMA, because the AMA doesn't conduct research. It publishes research in its journal. The AMA published the results of 100 test cases in its status report on Krebiozen from October 1951. These reports came from 7 research sites across the US, none of which were in California. No institution in California ever conducted a Krebiozen trial, as far as I can find, in 1951 or any other time. There's no record that Philip West ever touched a single ampule of Krebiozen, or used it on a lab mouse, never mind a human being. West's blood serum tests were used to show the ineffectiveness of Krebiozen by another researcher, and it's for this expertise that West was later named as a possible witness to testify against Krebiozen when the AMA tried to respond to those conspiracy accusations after 1953. But the Krebiozen itself isn't the only thing missing. No Mr. Wright died at the Long Beach VA hospital in the last 3 months of 1951. Of the half dozen or so Mr. Wrights who died in LA County at the end of 1951, one was in his 90s, one was just born, and none of the others died of anything resembling lymphosarcoma. Even if you ignore all the missing pieces that make this story impossible, the story itself makes no sense. Klopfer says Mr. Wright was barred from the trial due to the research protocols issued by the Krebiozen Committee. But there were no such research protocols issued to anyone testing Krebiozen. The research protocols themselves are ridiculous. In 1951, it would be nearly impossible to find any cancer patient who was both beyond the help of all other interventions and was guaranteed to live another 3 to 6 months. Ivy's own case files show Krebiozen administered to patients with an average life expectancy of 1 to 6 weeks. The Dr. West in the story is also a problem. The real Dr. West was an accomplished cancer researcher in 1951, sitting on quite the publication record with a long career ahead of him, whereas the West of the story is a dangerous, unethical incompetent. Fictional West should have no reason to think Krebiozen is anything other than a promising cancer treatment, presumably one that wouldn't work on people 1 weekend away from death if the protocols were real. Yet fictional West includes Wright in the trial anyway, despite his disqualifying attributes, which wouldn't just mess up the research, but would also exclude another patient that did qualify, possibly condemning them to death. Luckily in the story, it seems to do everything promised in the initial press release, at least on Mr. Wright. Holy shit, Krebiozen works. What other conclusion would there be? A person who read about Krebiozen in all of the books and hearings over the next 5 years would know when cancer specialists started to get discouraging results. But Mr. Wright in 1951 would not. There was no public coverage in mid-August that would have caused Mr. Wright's doubts, relapse, and return to the hospital. The real West would also have been tracking the effectiveness of Krebiozen, using the blood enzyme test, which he literally helped invent. But when Wright comes back 2 months later, fictional West doesn't repeat the medication that worked the first time. He immediately lies to his patient and shoots him full of water. Finally, after all of that, there's also the miracle itself, Wright's healing. Spontaneous remission of cancer is discussed in the literature of the 1950s. But when doctors talk about remission, they're talking about clinical remission, a cancer becoming inactive or dormant, and sometimes regressing for some unknown reason. They also talk about it as a typically temporary thing. They usually don't mean a spontaneous cure or a complete disappearance of the disease. And even in those rare 1 in 100,000 cases where you have an actual case report that says spontaneous remission with a disappearing cancer and a bewildered doctor, we aren't talking about cases where the cancer has destroyed vital organs or replaced bones or skin. If you suddenly had a bowling ball teleport inside of you, sit there for 5 minutes, and then disappear just as suddenly, you're not going to shrug off the experience just because the bowling ball's not there anymore. That milky fluid, supposedly drained from the lungs of Mr. Wright, indicates a level of tissue damage that wouldn't just go away in a few days, whether the cancer disappeared or not. The story Bruno Klopfer told in 1957 isn't just medically impossible, it's also historically and logistically impossible. The curious case of Mr. Wright isn't true, which means somebody made it up. Either the real West sent Klopfer an insane story for some reason, and Bruno was thick enough to repeat it, or Klopfer made the whole thing up to legitimize his pet theories, and West never challenged the use of his name. Either he didn't know, didn't care, or couldn't do anything about it. That's a question I'm still trying to answer, hopefully in the Worst Questions episode for this video. But for now, at least, it's safe to say that the curious case of Mr. Wright is fiction. So why do we still hear about it? The case of Mr. Wright is supposedly a story about the power our beliefs can exert on reality. And in a way, it is just that. You can't blame a cancer patient who believes they might be spared by a miracle. Whether that miracle comes from inside a little glass bottle or from inside their own mind. Desperation has a way of making calm, logical analysis seem like a luxury. It's harder to have sympathy for someone like Dr. Ivy. His dogged reluctance to acknowledge reality came from fear that he would be embarrassed and destroy his career. In the end, that's exactly what he accomplished. That's how avoidance works. But empathize or not, you can at least understand his mistake. As for Klopfer, it turns out his speech in 1957 overstates his involvement with that research project of West's. The final paper mentions the Rorschach only once, to explain that it was given as a supplementary test with several others. Bruno Klopfer is not thanked, nor does his name appear in the paper's references. Klopfer and his pet theories received the obvious benefit of repeatedly validating the Rorschach test, and it's Klopfer and his theories who stand to benefit from the story of Mr. Wright. A fantastic tale illustrating the extreme ways the unconscious mind can manifest and its control over the body. Just like Krebiozen, no one would believe this story if it didn't come with the name of a famous scientist attached. Neither Klopfer nor West are still alive, so whether Klopfer made the whole thing up or was just a sucker for believing a story fabricated by West is hard to prove. What is certain is that Klopfer used the story of Wright to add legitimacy to one of his theories, and in doing so, he opened the door to the next generation of medical quackery. He created a tool which helps them separate sick people from their money. Krebiozen was mineral oil. It was already a placebo. And in the story, Mr. Wright died not because it wasn't real medicine, but because he dared to have doubts. For anybody in the business of sham medicine, that's a useful message. Ask more questions at your own peril. This is the only story where you can actually see the handoff between the age of scamming people with a mysterious concoction and scamming them with mysterious beliefs. And in fine Krebiozen tradition, Mr. Wright's story is still told by people willing to turn desperation into dollars. So, the next time you see this story in a textbook, read it in an article presenting the placebo effect as a mysterious superpower, or hear it in a speech by a wingnut health guru, feel free to point out they didn't do their homework, and ask them to take some responsibility for the truth. The story of Mr. Wright doesn't demonstrate the power of the placebo effect. It's actually misinformation and a distraction from ironing out exactly what the placebo effect really is. And it's not a useful anecdote about hope or evidence about anything. It never happened. Mr. Wright lived up to his name. He somehow found out that his very hospitable, Jesus. To Dr. West's, to the amazement of Dr. Rest, there's nothing in Rest's than a careful and conscientious, some mysterious yet powerful, non-toxic, universally, inexpensive yet universally, Columbia University in 1936.